marked by the Bloodmoon. Lysandra Vale had always known she was different, but she never knew why. The town of Ashenridge had whispered about her since birth, about the night she was found on the church steps beneath a blood-red moon. She had ignored them until the dreams began, until she woke with claw marks on her arms and a voice whispering her name in the wind. On the 7th night, she stepped outside and found him waiting. A man with golden eyes and a presence that made the air crackle. "You were never meant to live beyond this moon," he murmured, stepping closer. "And now, I've come to take you back." Chapter 1. The Whispers of Ashenridge. The wind carried the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves, a familiar perfume that usually soothed Lysandra Vale. Tonight, however, it felt like a shroud, clinging to her with a damp, unsettling chill. Ashenridge, nestled deep in a valley shadowed by ancient pines, had always been a place of whispers. And for as long as she could remember, those whispers had been about her. She sat on the porch swing, the rusted chains groaning a mournful tune with each sway. The porch light cast a pale yellow circle, barely piercing the encroaching darkness. From here, she could see the flickering lights of the town, hear the distant murmur of voices, the occasional bark of a dog. Ordinary sounds, yet they felt alien tonight, as if she were listening from a world apart. Lysandra was 57, her life etched onto her face in a delicate tracery of lines around her kind, gray eyes and the corners of her mouth. Her hair, once the color of ripe wheat, was now streaked with silver, pulled back in a loose braid that fell down her back. She wore a simple, worn cotton dress, the fabric soft against her skin, a hand-knitted shawl draped around her shoulders against the autumn chill. Her hands, roughened by years of gardening and tending to the small apothecary shop she ran in town, were clasped tightly in her lap. The whispers they had started the day she was found, abandoned on the steps of St. Jude's Church, wrapped in a blood-stained blanket beneath a full moon that hung, impossibly crimson, in the sky. Old Mrs. Abernathy, the church organist, had been the one to find her, claiming the air had crackled with an unnatural energy, the scent of ozone thick and heavy. Devil's child, some had hissed, their voices laced with fear and superstition. Cursed, others whispered, crossing themselves as she passed. Even those who tried to be kind, like Father Michael, the aging priest who had taken her in and raised her with a gentle hand, couldn't entirely silence the town's unease. She'd learned to ignore it, to build a wall around her heart, to find solace in the quiet rhythm of her life. The tending of her herbs, the brewing of teas and tinctures, the small, everyday acts of kindness she offered to the townsfolk, these were her anchors in a sea of suspicion. But the dreams had shattered that carefully constructed peace. They had started a week ago, vivid and terrifying. Images of dark forests, of running through undergrowth that snagged at her clothes and skin, of a presence, vast and menacing, watching her from the shadows. She would wake gasping for breath, her heart pounding, the scent of pine needles and something wilder, something animalistic, clinging to her. And then the marks. She rolled up the sleeve of her dress, revealing the pale skin of her forearm. 3 parallel lines, raw and red, scored her flesh. Claw marks. She hadn't felt them being made, hadn't seen anything in her room that could have caused them. But there they were, undeniable proof that something was terribly wrong. Tonight, the 7th night, the dreams had been more intense, more real. She had heard a voice, a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in her very bones, calling her name. Lysandra, it had whispered, a sound both terrifying and strangely familiar. A sudden gust of wind rattled the wind chimes hanging from the porch eaves, their delicate music jarringly discordant in the stillness. Lysandra shivered, pulling her shawl tighter. She looked out at the road leading to her small cottage, a dirt track winding its way through the darkening woods. It was then she saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of the trees, a pair of eyes reflecting the moonlight. Golden eyes, burning with an intensity that sent a jolt of fear through her. They held an ancient knowledge, a primal power that seemed to reach out and grip her soul. She stood, her legs trembling, the porch swing swaying silently behind her. The figure emerged from the shadows, resolving into the form of a man. Tall and broad-shouldered, he moved with a fluid grace that belied his size. He wore dark clothes, jeans, and a heavy leather jacket that blended with the night. His hair was dark, streaked with silver at the temples, framing a face that was both strikingly handsome and deeply unsettling. He stopped at the edge of her property, his gaze unwavering. The air crackled, just as Mrs. Abernathy had described all those years ago. The scent of ozone mingled with the earthy aroma of the woods and something else, something musky, almost animalistic, that made her breath catch in her throat. He tilted his head, a slight, almost imperceptible movement, and a faint smile touched his lips. It was not a comforting smile. It was the smile of a predator, of something that had waited a long time for its prey. He spoke, his voice the same low rumble she had heard in her dreams, and the words, though softly spoken, seemed to echo through the silent night, erasing all other sounds, all other thoughts, all other possibilities. They were right to whisper, "Lysandra." He took one step, and then another. The wind seemed to hush, holding its breath. The lights of the town became small and distant. The sounds of the world fell away. They were right to be afraid. Chapter 2. Dreams of Crimson and Claw.
Who are you?
Lysandra managed, her voice a thin thread against the backdrop of his overwhelming presence. She clutched the shawl tighter, her knuckles white, the ruffle a small, familiar comfort against the rising tide of fear. Her mind raced, searching for a rational explanation, a way to dismiss this as a hallucination, a trick of the light and shadow. But the intensity of his gaze, the palpable energy radiating from him, defied logic. He took another step, closing the distance between them, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. The scent of him intensified, a potent blend of pine, earth, and something wilder, something that triggered a primal instinct within her, a desperate urge to flee. Yet, her feet felt rooted to the spot, her body betraying her mind's frantic pleas. "I am the answer to the questions you haven't dared to ask," he replied, his voice a low, resonant murmur that seemed to vibrate in the very air around them. He stopped just outside the circle of light cast by the porch lamp, his face still partially obscured by shadow, making him seem even more enigmatic, more dangerous. "Questions?" Lysandra repeated, her voice trembling slightly. She forced herself to meet his gaze, to hold his stare, refusing to show the terror that was churning inside her.
I don't understand."
He tilted his head, a flicker of something that might have been amusement in his golden eyes.
Don't you?
The dreams, Lysandra, the marks on your arm, the whispers that have followed you your entire life. They are not random, not meaningless. They are echoes of a truth you were never meant to know. His words struck a chord deep within her, resonating with a fear she had suppressed for years. The dreams, she had tried to dismiss them as stress, as the product of an overactive imagination. But the marks, they were undeniable. And the whispers, they had always been there, a constant reminder that she was different, that she didn't belong. "What truth?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He stepped fully into the light, and Lysandra gasped. His face was even more striking up close, his features strong and sharply defined, his jawline firm, his cheekbones high. His eyes, those mesmerizing golden eyes, seemed to glow with an inner light, captivating and terrifying in equal measure. There was a weariness in them, too, a hint of sadness that surprised her. It was the face of a man who had seen too much, who carried burdens she couldn't comprehend. "The truth of your heritage," he said, his voice softening slightly. "The truth of what you are." He reached out a hand, slowly, deliberately, as if approaching a frightened animal. Lysandra flinched, instinctively recoiling, but he didn't stop. His fingertips brushed against her cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. His skin was surprisingly warm, almost feverish, and she could feel the faint tremor in his hand. "You are not like them, Lysandra," he continued, his voice a husky whisper that seemed to wrap around her like a dark cloak. "You are moonbound. Like me." Moonbound. The word hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. It echoed the dreams, the crimson moon that had hung in the sky the night she was found, the primal fear that had gripped her since the nightmares began. She looked at his hand, still hovering near her face. His fingers were long and strong, the nails slightly elongated, almost claw-like. She remembered the marks on her arm, the raw, parallel lines that had appeared without explanation. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she swayed, her knees threatening to buckle. He caught her, his arm wrapping around her waist, supporting her with an effortless strength that both terrified and comforted her. She could feel the heat of his body through her clothes, the steady beat of his heart against her back. "Don't be afraid," he murmured, his breath warm against her ear. "I won't hurt you. I'm here to protect you." Protect her? From what? From whom? The question swirled in her mind, unanswered, lost in the overwhelming sensory overload of his presence. She looked up at him, her gray eyes searching his golden ones, trying to find a flicker of truth, a hint of reassurance in their depths. But all she saw was a reflection of her own fear, mingled with a strange, undeniable pull, a connection that defied logic and reason. It was as if some ancient, forgotten part of her recognized him, knew him, despite the terror that gripped her mind. "The moon it calls to us," he said, his voice a low, hypnotic rumble. "It binds us. And tonight, it demands its due." He tightened his hold. The moon continued to climb in the sky, round, almost full, beginning to stain red. "Tonight, you change." Chapter 3. The Wolf at the Doorstep. Change? Lysandra's voice was a choked whisper, barely audible above the sudden pounding of her heart. The word echoed the primal fear that had been building within her since the dreams began, the unsettling feeling of something wild and untamed stirring beneath her skin. She looked at him, this stranger with the golden eyes and the unsettling aura, and a terrifying thought took root in her mind. Werewolf. The word was a relic of old stories, of whispered tales told around crackling fires on dark nights. Tales of men who transformed into beasts under the light of the full moon, creatures of instinct and violence. She had always dismissed them as folklore, as the product of superstitious minds. But now, standing here in the presence of this man, the impossible seemed terrifyingly real. He nodded, his gaze unwavering, his golden eyes seeming to pierce through her, stripping away her defenses, her carefully constructed reality. "The change is upon you, Lysandra. It has been delayed, suppressed, but it can no longer be denied. Tonight, the moon will claim you." His words sent a shiver of ice down her spine. She tried to pull away, to break free from his hold, but his grip tightened, his strength overwhelming. It wasn't a cruel grip, not painful, but it was absolute, unbreakable. He held her with a possessiveness that both terrified and strangely comforted her. "No," she protested, her voice trembling. That's impossible. I'm just an ordinary woman. I run an apothecary shop. I make tea and tinctures." "I don't," he cut her off, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through her very bones. "You are anything but ordinary, Lysandra. You are a descendant of a powerful lineage, a line of werewolves that stretches back centuries. Your blood carries the ancient magic, the primal power of the moon." He reached out and gently touched the claw marks on her arm, his fingertips tracing the raw, red lines. Lysandra flinched, but his touch was surprisingly gentle, almost healing. The burning sensation seemed to subside, replaced by a strange, tingling warmth. "These marks, they are a sign," he said, his voice softening. "A sign that the change is beginning. Your body is preparing itself for the transformation." Lysandra stared at the marks, her mind reeling. She had tried to find a rational explanation, to convince herself that she had somehow scratched herself in her sleep. But deep down, she had known the truth. She had felt it in her bones, in the growing unease that had settled over her in recent days, in the wild, untamed energy that seemed to throb beneath her skin. "But why me?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why now? I've lived here my whole life. Nothing like this has ever happened before." He sighed, a hint of sadness in his eyes. Your powers were suppressed, hidden, protected. The circumstances of your birth, the ritual performed that night, it was all designed to keep you safe, to shield you from your true nature. Ritual? Lysandra repeated, her mind struggling to grasp the implications of his words. What ritual?
What are you talking about?
He hesitated, a flicker of conflict crossing his face. It's a long story, Lysandra. A story filled with secrets and betrayals. There isn't time to explain it all now. The moon is rising. The change is coming. He looked up at the sky, at the full moon that hung heavy and crimson above them. It seemed to pulse with a strange, ethereal light, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. Lysandra felt a strange pull, a yearning, a sense of something ancient and powerful awakening within her. What will happen to me? She asked, her voice trembling with fear and a strange, unexpected flicker of excitement. He turned back to her, his golden eyes locking onto hers. You will transform, he said, his voice a low, hypnotic murmur. You will become what you were always meant to be. A creature of the night, a child of the moon. A werewolf. He paused, his gaze softening. It will be painful, Lysandra. The first change always is. But I will be here. I will guide you through it. I will protect you. His words, meant to be reassuring, sent a fresh wave of terror through her. The thought of transforming into a beast, of losing control, of becoming something wild and untamed, was terrifying. But beneath the fear, there was also a strange sense of inevitability, of destiny. She looked at him, this stranger who claimed to know her, who claimed to be like her, and a desperate question escaped her lips. And after? After the change, what then? She searched his eyes for a flicker of cruelty, but she saw nothing. He looked at her, his gaze piercing, seeing straight through her fear and anxiety. He smiled, a slow, sad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Then, Lysandra, he said, his voice heavy with unspoken meaning, your real life begins. The moon, now fully red, cast long shadows. He tightened his arm around her.
Hold on.
Chapter 4. A pact sealed in moonlight. The pain hit her like a tidal wave, a searing, all-consuming agony that ripped through every fiber of her being. Lysandra cried out, a raw, animalistic sound that was torn from her throat, echoing through the silent night. Her knees buckled, and she would have collapsed if not for the man's strong arms holding her upright. He held her close, his body a solid, reassuring presence against the storm raging within her. She could feel the heat radiating from him, the steady beat of his heart against her back, a grounding rhythm in the chaos of her transformation. Breathe, Lysandra, he murmured, his voice a low, calming rumble in her ear. Let it happen. Don't fight it. But fighting it was all she could do. Her bones felt like they were breaking, shifting, rearranging themselves into something alien, something monstrous. Her muscles spasmed, twisting and contorting, tearing at her skin. She could feel her teeth elongating, her nails thickening, her senses sharpening to an almost unbearable degree. The scent of pine needles and damp earth, which had been a subtle backdrop before, now overwhelmed her, mingling with the metallic tang of blood and the musky, animalistic scent of herself. The sounds of the night, the rustling of leaves, the hooting of an owl, the distant howl of a wolf were amplified, echoing in her skull. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sensory overload, the excruciating pain, but it was no use. The transformation was relentless, unstoppable, a force of nature that was tearing her apart and remaking her in its image. It's too much, she gasped, her voice a choked whisper. I can't. Yes, you can, he insisted, his voice firm, unwavering. You are stronger than you know, Lysandra. You are a veil. You carry the strength of generations within you. His words, his belief in her, gave her a flicker of hope, a small spark of defiance in the face of the overwhelming pain. She clung to that spark, to the feeling of his arms around her, to the sound of his voice, anchors in the storm. She opened her eyes, and the world swam into focus, sharper, more vibrant, more terrifying than she had ever seen it before. The moon, hanging high above, seemed to pulse with a crimson light, bathing the landscape in an eerie glow. She could see every detail, every leaf on every tree, every blade of grass, every shadow that danced in the darkness. And then she saw herself. Reflected in the dark glass of the porch window, she saw a creature that was both familiar and utterly alien. Her human form was gone, replaced by the sleek, powerful body of a wolf. Her fur was the color of moonlight, a silvery white that shimmered in the darkness. Her eyes, no longer gray, but the same burning gold as his. She stared at her reflection, her mind reeling, unable to comprehend the reality of what she had become. She was a wolf, a creature of myth and legend, a being she had always believed to be nothing more than a story. The man, he was still there, standing beside her, his human form unchanged, his golden eyes watching her with a mixture of concern and pride. He reached out a hand, slowly, deliberately, and gently stroked the fur on her head. The touch sent a wave of warmth through her, calming the frantic beating of her wolf heart. "You are beautiful, Lysandra," he murmured, his voice a low, husky rumble that resonated deep within her. "You are magnificent." His words, his acceptance, eased the terror that had gripped her, replaced it with a strange, exhilarating sense of freedom. She felt a power surging through her, a primal energy that had been dormant for so long, now unleashed untamed. She took a tentative step, her paws sinking slightly into the soft earth. She felt the ground beneath her, solid and real, the cool night air on her fur, the sense of the forest filling her nostrils. She lifted her head and let out a howl, a long, mournful cry that echoed through the valley, a sound of both pain and triumph. He held back, a deep, resonant sound that answered her call, a sound of kinship, of belonging. It was a pact, sealed in moonlight, a promise of protection, of guidance, of a shared destiny. He shifted then, his body rippling, his bones cracking, his form changing with a speed and fluidity that took her breath away. In seconds, he stood before her, no longer a man, but a wolf, larger than her, his fur the color of dark shadows, his eyes the same burning gold. He nudged her gently with his snout, a silent invitation, and then he turned and loped towards the woods, his powerful body moving with effortless grace. Lysandra hesitated for a moment, her human mind still struggling to comprehend what was happening, but the pull of her wolf instincts was too strong to resist. She followed him, her paws finding their own rhythm, her body moving with a newfound agility, a primal grace that felt both alien and utterly natural. As she ran, she felt the last vestiges of her human fear melting away, replaced by the exhilarating freedom of the wolf, the thrill of the hunt, the call of the wild. She was no longer Lysandra Vale, the apothecary, the outcast, the woman haunted by whispers. She was something more, something ancient, something powerful. She was moonbound. She glanced back one last time, to where her small, empty, little cottage stood. The life she'd known, the life she had lost. And as the trillion swallowed her, she knew there was only forward. Chapter 5. Echoes of a Forgotten Past. The forest embraced them, a cathedral of ancient pines and rustling leaves, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying wood. Lysandra followed the dark wolf, her senses heightened, her instincts sharp, her body moving with a fluid grace she had never known before. The fear had receded, replaced by a strange sense of exhilaration, of freedom, of coming home. He led her deeper into the woods, away from the town, away from the life she had known, towards a destination she didn't understand but instinctively trusted. He moved with a confidence, a familiarity that spoke of years spent navigating these shadowed paths, a silent guide in this new, terrifying, and exhilarating world. They ran for what felt like hours, the moon their only companion, casting long, dancing shadows that stretched and distorted the familiar landscape into something both magical and menacing. Lysandra found herself marveling at the speed and agility of her new form, the way her paws effortlessly gripped the uneven terrain, the way her muscles responded instinctively to every twist and turn. Finally, he stopped at the edge of a clearing, a hidden sanctuary bathed in the soft glow of the moon. In the center of the clearing stood a small, ancient cabin, its weathered logs blending seamlessly with the surrounding trees. Smoke curled from its chimney, carrying the scent of wood smoke and something else, something warm and inviting, that stirred a faint memory within her. He turned to her, his golden eyes meeting hers, a silent communication passing between them. He shifted back then, his body reforming into its human shape with a grace that still startled her. He was naked, his skin gleaming in the moonlight, his body lean and muscular, a testament to the power he held within. He didn't seem to notice or care about his nudity, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Lysandra hesitated, unsure, her human mind still struggling to reconcile the two halves of her being, the woman and the wolf. She looked down at her paws, at the silvery fur that covered her body, and a wave of self-consciousness washed over her. He seemed to understand her hesitation, his gaze softening. He walked towards the cabin, disappearing inside for a moment, and then re-emerged, carrying a large, thick blanket woven from coarse wool. He held it out to her, a silent offering, a gesture of understanding and acceptance. She approached him cautiously, her wolf instincts wary, but her human heart drawn to his kindness. She shifted back, the change still painful, but less so than before. Her bones were forming, her muscles reshaping, her skin tingling with a strange, electric sensation. She wrapped the blanket around her, grateful for its warmth and the sense of modesty it provided. "Thank you," she said, her voice hoarse, still adjusting to its human timbre. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Come inside, Lysandra. It's cold out here." She followed him into the cabin, her senses still heightened, taking in every detail of her surroundings. The interior was small and rustic, but surprisingly cozy. A fire crackled merrily in a stone hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. The walls were lined with bookshelves filled with leather-bound volumes, and the air was thick with the scent of old paper and dried herbs, a scent that was strangely familiar, comforting. "This place it feels," she began, her voice trailing off, unable to find the right words. "Familiar?" He finished for her, his gaze knowing. "It should. It belonged to your ancestors, Lysandra. To your grandmother, specifically." His words sent a jolt through her. Her grandmother? She had never known her grandmother, had never known anything about her family, her past. Father Michael had told her very little, only that her mother had died giving birth to her, and that her father was unknown. "My grandmother was a werewolf?" she asked, the question both a statement and a plea for answers. He nodded, his golden eyes holding hers.
"Yes."
Her name was Alara. She was a powerful woman, a healer, a leader of her pack. She was the one who arranged for your protection, who cast the spell that suppressed your powers.
"But why?"
Lysandra asked, her voice filled with confusion and a growing sense of betrayal. "Why would she do that? Why would she hide me from my own heritage?" He sighed, a hint of sadness in his eyes. "It was a different time, Lysandra. Werewolves were hunted, persecuted. Your grandmother feared for your safety. She believed that the only way to protect you was to hide you, to make you appear ordinary." He walked over to the fireplace, adding another log to the flames. The fire crackled, sending sparks dancing into the air, illuminating his face, highlighting the lines of weariness and regret etched around his eyes. "She made a mistake," he continued, his voice low and filled with a pain that resonated deep within Lysandra. "She underestimated the power of the moon, the strength of your blood. She thought she could control it, contain it, but she couldn't. The change was inevitable." He turned back to her, his gaze intense. "And now you are here. And you are in danger." His eyes held hers. She felt her heartbeat, no longer the frantic rhythm of the terrified, but steady and strong.
"Danger?"
she repeated, her voice becoming firmer. "From whom?" He hesitated, a flicker of conflict crossing his face. The fire crackled, louder now. The silence stretched, and then a single word hung in the air. Hunters. Chapter 6. The Scent of Pine and Blood. Hunters, Lysandra repeated, the word a cold knot in her stomach. It conjured images of shadowed figures with weapons, of traps and silver bullets, of the stories she had dismissed as folklore now taking on a terrifying reality.
Who are they?
What do they want? She still didn't know his name paced the small cabin, his movements restless, his body radiating a tension that made the air crackle. He ran a hand through his dark, silver-streaked hair, his golden eyes clouded with worry. They are an ancient order, he said, his voice low and grave, dedicated to eradicating our kind. They believe we are monsters, abominations, a threat to humanity. They have hunted us for centuries, driven us into hiding, forced us to live in the shadows. He stopped pacing and turned to face her, his gaze intense. They know about you, Lysandra. They know about the ritual, about your grandmother's attempt to suppress your powers. They have been watching Ashenridge, waiting for the moon to trigger your change. Lysandra wrapped the blanket tighter around herself, her body trembling despite the warmth of the fire. The fear she had felt during the transformation, the primal terror of becoming a wolf, was nothing compared to this cold, calculated dread that now gripped her. But why me? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I was just an ordinary woman. I'm no threat to anyone. He sighed, a hint of sadness in his eyes. You are far from ordinary, Lysandra. You are a Vale, a descendant of a powerful bloodline. Your grandmother was a legend among our kind, and you carry her strength, her potential. They fear what you could become. He walked over to a wooden chest tucked away in a corner of the cabin and opened it. He rummaged inside, pulling out a long, sheathed object. He turned back to her, holding it out. Lysandra hesitated, her eyes fixed on the object in his hands. It was a knife, its blade long and curved, crafted from a dark, gleaming metal that seemed to absorb the light. The hilt was made of bone, intricately carved with symbols she didn't recognize but felt a strange, instinctive connection to. This belonged to your grandmother, he said, his voice softening. It's called a moonfang. It's forged from a special alloy, imbued with ancient magic. It's one of the few weapons that can truly harm a werewolf. He unsheathed the blade, and Lysandra gasped. The metal seemed to shimmer in the firelight, almost alive, pulsing with a power that both terrified and fascinated her. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the cold, smooth surface of the blade. I don't know how to use it, she said, her voice shaking. He smiled, a faint, reassuring smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I will teach you, he said. I will teach you everything you need to know. How to fight, how to survive, how to embrace your power. He stepped closer, his body radiating warmth, his scent a comforting blend of pine and earth and something else. Something that stirred a faint memory, a flicker of recognition deep within her. What's your name? She asked suddenly, the question blurting out before she could stop herself. He paused, his gaze meeting hers, a flicker of surprise in his golden eyes. He seemed to consider the question for a moment, as if it were something he hadn't thought about in a long time. Caleb, he said finally, his voice a low murmur. My name is Caleb.
Caleb.
The name suited him, she thought. Strong, yet gentle, with a hint of mystery, of hidden depths. Caleb, she repeated, testing the name on her tongue, feeling its weight, its significance. It was a name she would trust, a name she would fight beside, a name that was already becoming intertwined with her own. He sheathed the moonfang and placed it on the table, his gaze still locked on hers. We need to prepare, Lysandra. The hunters will be coming. We don't have much time. He walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness, his body tense, alert. The moon was beginning to wane, its crimson glow fading, but the threat remained, a palpable presence in the night air. Lysandra stood there, wrapped in the blanket, the moonfang lying on the table beside her, a symbol of the danger she faced, of the life she had been thrust into. She looked at Caleb, his silhouette framed against the moonlit window, and a sense of determination, of resolve, began to harden within her. She was afraid, yes, but she was also angry. Angry at the hunters, at the fear they instilled, at the life they had stolen from her. She was a Vale, a descendant of a powerful lineage, and she would not be hunted. She would not hide. She would fight. Tell me what I need to do. She took a step closer, her bare feet silent on the wood floor.
Teach me.
Caleb turned, his eyes glinting with something that hadn't been there before. The barest hint of respect. The smallest spark of hope. He nodded. The first lesson, however, hit her like a punch to the gut. First, he said, his voice grave and low, you have to learn to control the shift. And that includes learning to control your scent. Because to a hunter, he paused, his eyes like molten gold. You smell like blood. Chapter 7. Running with Shadows. The training began before dawn. Caleb was a relentless teacher, pushing Lysandra to her limits, both physically and mentally. He taught her how to control the shift, how to move between her human and wolf forms with speed and fluidity, how to harness the power that surged within her. It was grueling, painful, and often frustrating, but Lysandra persevered, driven by a fierce determination to survive, to protect herself, to master this new reality. He showed her how to move silently through the forest, how to track scents, how to use her heightened senses to her advantage. He taught her how to fight, using the moonfang and her own claws and teeth, how to anticipate an attack, how to exploit an opponent's weakness. The most difficult lesson, however, was controlling her scent. As a newly turned werewolf, Lysandra's scent was raw, powerful, a beacon to any hunter who might be nearby. Caleb explained that experienced werewolves learned to mask their scent, to blend in with their surroundings, to become virtually invisible to their enemies. It's a matter of control, Lysandra, he said, his voice low and patient. Of channeling your inner wolf, of mastering your emotions. Fear, anger, excitement, they all amplify your scent. You need to learn to suppress them, to become blank. He demonstrated, showing her how to focus her mind, to quiet her thoughts, to regulate her breathing. He taught her how to use the natural scents of the forest, of pine needles, damp earth, and decaying leaves, to mask her own. It was incredibly challenging. Lysandra struggled to control her emotions, to quiet the fear and anxiety that constantly churned within her. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her, amplifying her scent, betraying her presence. Again, Caleb would say, his voice firm but not unkind. Focus, Lysandra. Empty your mind. Become one with the forest. They spent hours practicing, running through the woods, hiding amongst the trees, stalking each other like prey. Caleb would track her, his senses honed by years of experience, pointing out every mistake, every lapse in her control. Slowly, gradually, she began to improve. She learned to regulate her breathing, to quiet her thoughts, to suppress the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. She learned to use the natural sense of the forest to her advantage, to blend in with her surroundings, to become a shadow, a whisper in the wind. But it wasn't just the physical training that challenged her. It was the emotional toll, the constant fear of discovery, the knowledge that she was being hunted, that her life was in danger. She missed her old life, her quiet routine, her apothecary shop, the familiar faces of the townsfolk. She mourned the loss of her innocence, of her sense of security, of the illusion that she was just an ordinary woman. One evening, as they sat by the fire, exhausted from a day of training, Lysandra finally voiced the question that had been haunting her. Caleb, she said, her voice low and hesitant. Why are you helping me? You could have just left me. You could have let the hunters find me. He looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a complex mixture of emotions. He sighed, running a hand through his hair, his gaze shifting to the flickering flames. I made a promise, he said, his voice heavy with unspoken meaning. To your grandmother. I promised her I would protect you, guide you, if the time ever came. He paused, his gaze meeting hers again, a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. And I owe her. I owe her a great debt. She saved my life many years ago. I was young, reckless, hunted. She took me in, healed me, taught me how to control my powers. He looked away, his voice barely a whisper. She was like a mother to me. Lysandra felt a pang of sympathy for him, for the pain she heard in his voice, for the burden of responsibility he carried. She realized that he was just as much a victim of this ancient conflict as she was, that he had his own scars, his own losses. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "For keeping your promise. For helping me." He smiled, a faint, sad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "We are in this together, Lysandra. We are bound. By the moon, by our heritage, by the danger we face." He stood up, his body tense, alert. He walked over to the window, peering out into the darkness. The moon was a sliver in the sky, casting long, eerie shadows. "We need to move," he said, his voice urgent. "They're getting closer. I can feel it." Lysandra felt a chill run down her spine. She knew he was right. She could feel it too, a growing sense of unease, of being watched, of being hunted. She stood up, her body ready, her senses heightened. She picked up the moonfang, its weight familiar and comforting in her hand. She was still afraid, but she was no longer helpless. She was a wolf, a warrior, a survivor. "Where will we go?" she asked, her chin lifted, her voice no longer trembling. He turned back to her, his golden eyes meeting hers. "Somewhere they won't find us," he said, his voice determined. "Somewhere we can be safe. Somewhere we can disappear." He stepped closer, the faint moonlight casting his features into stark contrast. We run. Chapter 8. The Hunter's Moon Rises. The journey was a blur of shadowed forests, rushing rivers, and wind-swept hills. They traveled mostly at night, under the cloak of darkness, moving swiftly and silently, like ghosts in the moonlight. Caleb led the way, his senses sharp, his instincts honed by years of living on the run. Lysandra followed, her own senses growing stronger with each passing day, her body adapting to the demands of their relentless pace. They avoided towns and villages, sticking to the wilderness, relying on their skills to hunt and forage for food. Caleb taught her how to identify edible plants, how to track animals, how to build a fire without smoke, how to survive in the wild. The days were spent resting in hidden shelters, caves, and abandoned cabins, thickets of trees, so dense they blotted out the sun. They spoke little, conserving their energy, their silence punctuated by the sounds of the forest, the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the distant howl of a wolf, a sound that both comforted and terrified Lysandra. She was learning to control her fear, to channel it into focus, into alertness. But the constant threat of discovery, the knowledge that they were being hunted, hung over them like a dark cloud, casting a shadow over every moment. One night, as they were camped beneath a rocky overhang, sheltering from a cold, drizzling rain, Lysandra noticed a change in Caleb's demeanor. He was more restless than usual, his senses on high alert, his body radiating a tension that made her own skin prickle with unease. "What is it?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the overhang, his nostrils flaring slightly, as if testing the wind. "They're close," he said finally, his voice a barely audible whisper. "I can smell them." Lysandra felt a chill run down her spine. She closed her eyes, concentrating, trying to filter out the natural scents of the forest, the damp earth, the wet leaves, the scent of Caleb. And then she caught it, a faint, acrid odor, a mixture of metal and something else. Something foul, something that made her wolf instincts scream in warning. "Hunters," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. Caleb nodded, his golden eyes gleaming in the darkness. "More than one. And they have dogs."
Dogs.
The word sent a fresh wave of fear through her. She had learned from Caleb that hunters often use specially trained dogs, bred to track werewolves, their senses amplified, their instincts honed to kill. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice tight with anxiety. He looked at her, his gaze intense.
We run, he said.
But we need to be smart. We need to confuse them, to throw them off our trail. He explained his plan, a series of maneuvers designed to disorient the hunters and their dogs, to lead them away from their true path, to buy them time to escape. It was risky, dangerous, but it was their only chance. They waited until the moon was at its highest point, casting long, distorted shadows that would help to conceal their movements. Then, they slipped out from under the overhang, moving swiftly and silently into the darkness. Caleb led the way, weaving through the trees, crossing streams, doubling back on their trail, using every trick he knew to confuse their pursuers. Lysandra followed close behind, her senses on high alert, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the distant baying of the dogs, growing closer, louder, a terrifying chorus that sent shivers down her spine. She could smell the hunters, their acrid scent growing stronger, closer, a constant reminder of the danger they faced. They ran for what felt like hours, their lungs burning, their muscles aching, their bodies pushed to the very limit. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees becoming menacing figures, the shadows dancing like demons. Suddenly, Caleb stopped, his body tense, his head cocked to one side. He sniffed the air, his golden eyes narrowed. They've split up, he whispered. 2 groups. One is heading north, the other south. He looked at Lysandra, his gaze filled with concern. They're trying to flank us, to trap us. He paused, his mind racing, calculating their options. There was no time to discuss, to debate. He had to make a decision, and he had to make it fast. You go north, he said, his voice firm, decisive. Follow the river. It will lead you to higher ground, to a place where you can hide. But what about you? Lysandra asked, her voice filled with fear and a growing sense of something else. Something she couldn't quite name, something that felt like a tearing in her soul. I'll lead the other group away, he said, his voice reassuring. I'll draw them off your trail. I'll meet you later. He didn't specify where or when. He didn't promise anything. He just looked at her, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of determination and sadness. Lysandra wanted to protest, to argue, to refuse to leave him.
But she knew he was right.
It was their only chance. They had to split up, to divide the hunters' forces, to increase their odds of survival. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak, her eyes burning with unshed tears. He reached out and touched her cheek, a fleeting touch that sent a jolt of electricity through her. Go, he said, his voice a low, urgent whisper. Run, Lysandra. And don't look back. Then he turned and vanished into the darkness, his scent fading quickly, leaving her alone, facing the rising moon, the hunter's moon, now tinged with a familiar, dreaded crimson. The baying of dogs was very, very close. Chapter 9. Scars of the Soul. Lysandra ran. She ran as she had never run before, fueled by fear and adrenaline, her wolf instincts guiding her through the treacherous terrain. The baying of the dogs echoed behind her, growing fainter with each stride, a constant reminder of the danger she had narrowly escaped. She followed Caleb's instructions, heading north, towards the river. The cold water numbed her paws as she waded across, the current strong and swift, threatening to sweep her away. She scrambled up the opposite bank, her fur dripping, her body shivering, but she didn't stop. She had to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the hunters. She found the higher ground Caleb had spoken of, a rocky outcrop overlooking the forest, a natural fortress that offered a vantage point and some degree of protection. She found a small cave, hidden amongst the rocks, and crawled inside, collapsing in a heap, her body exhausted, her mind racing. She waited. Hours passed, marked only by the changing position of the moon, the shifting shadows, the sounds of the night. The baying of the dogs had long since faded, replaced by the silence of the wilderness, a silence that was both comforting and unsettling. She didn't know what had happened to Caleb. Had he escaped? Had he led the hunters away? Had he been caught? The questions tormented her, gnawing at her mind, filling her with a dread that was almost worse than the fear of being hunted. She thought about their time together, the training, the shared danger, the bond that had formed between them, a bond forged in moonlight and sealed in blood. She remembered his words, his touch, his scent, the way he had looked at her, with a mixture of concern, respect, and something else. Something she hadn't dared to acknowledge, to name until now. She realized, with a pang of regret, that she had come to rely on him, to trust him, to care for him, more than she had ever cared for anyone in her life. The thought of losing him, of never seeing him again, filled her with a pain that was sharper, more profound, than any physical wound. As the first rays of dawn painted the sky with pale streaks of pink and orange, Lysandra shifted back to her human form, the change still painful, but familiar now, a part of her. She wrapped herself in the blanket Caleb had given her, her body shivering, not just from the cold, but from the emotional turmoil that raged within her. She looked out at the forest, stretching out before her, vast and silent, a landscape that had once been her sanctuary, now a hunting ground. She felt utterly alone, vulnerable, lost. She noticed something then, a small detail she had overlooked in her exhaustion and fear. On her left arm, just above the wrist, was a new mark. It wasn't a claw mark, not like the ones that had heralded her transformation. This was different, a deliberate carving, a symbol etched into her skin. She traced the lines with her fingertip, her mind racing, trying to decipher its meaning. It was a circle, enclosing a crescent moon and a single star. It was a symbol she had seen before, on the hilt of the moonfang, on the books in Caleb's cabin, she gasped, her eyes widening in realization. It was the symbol of Caleb's pack, a mark of belonging, of protection, of claiming. He had marked her. Before he had left, before he had risked his life to save hers, he had marked her as his own. The realization sent a wave of emotions crashing over her, a complex mixture of fear, anger, gratitude, and hope. He had done it to protect her, to give her a chance, to show the hunters, if they found her, that she was not alone, that she belonged to someone, to something powerful. But it was also a risk, a gamble. If the hunters recognized the symbol, they would know who she was connected to. They would know that she was not just a rogue werewolf, but a member of a pack, a potential threat. Lysandra clutched the blanket tighter, her fingers digging into the coarse wool. She looked at the mark on her arm, a permanent reminder of Caleb, of his sacrifice, of the bond they shared. She didn't know what the future held, whether she would ever see him again, whether she would survive this hunt. But she knew one thing. She would not give up. She would honor his sacrifice, his belief in her. She would fight. For herself, for Caleb, for the memory of her grandmother, for the future of her kind. She stood up, her body still aching, her spirit wounded, but her resolve hardened. She would find a way to survive, to evade the hunters, to learn more about her heritage, about her powers, about the symbol that now marked her as one of the. A distant sound broke the silence, a faint, familiar sound that made her heart leap with both hope and fear. A howl. A single, mournful howl, echoing through the forest. A howl that she recognized, a howl that called to her, a howl that told her she was not alone. It wasn't close, but it was there. Chapter 10. A glimmer of forbidden trust. The howl hung in the air, a fragile thread of hope in the vastness of her fear. Lysandra strained her ears, listening intently, her heart pounding in her chest. It came again, fainter this time, carried on the wind, but unmistakable. It was Caleb's howl, his unique signature, the call that had answered hers on the night of her transformation. She wanted to answer, to howl back, to let him know she was alive, that she was safe. But she hesitated, her instincts warning her of the danger. The hunters could still be out there, listening, waiting. A single sound could betray her location, undo all their efforts to escape. She waited, agonizing minutes stretching into an eternity, her senses on high alert, scanning the forest for any sign of movement, any hint of danger. The howl didn't come again. Silence descended, heavy and oppressive, broken only by the rustling of leaves, the chirping of birds, the sounds of the awakening forest. Lysandra debated her options. Should she stay put, wait for Caleb to find her, as he had implied he would? Or should she try to find him, follow the direction of the howl, risk exposure to the hunters? She knew the risks. She was still relatively inexperienced, her scent control still imperfect, her knowledge of the forest limited. But the thought of staying put, of waiting passively, of not knowing what had happened to Caleb, was unbearable. She made her decision. She would try to find him. Carefully, cautiously, using all the skills he had taught her. She shifted back to her wolf form, the change becoming easier, smoother, more natural with each transformation. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with the sense of the forest, filtering out the familiar, focusing on the faint, lingering trace of Caleb. It was there, a subtle undercurrent beneath the dominant sense of pine and earth, a musky, animalistic aroma that tugged at her instincts, drawing her forward. She followed the scent, moving slowly, deliberately, staying low to the ground, using the shadows to conceal her movements. She traveled for hours, the sun climbing higher in the sky, casting dappled light through the trees. The forest was alive with activity, birds singing, squirrels chattering, deer grazing in hidden clearings. But Lysandra remained focused, her senses attuned to the faintest trace of Caleb's scent, her mind alert to any sign of danger. As the afternoon wore on, the scent grew stronger, fresher, leading her towards a dense thicket of trees, a tangle of undergrowth that seemed almost impenetrable. She hesitated, her instincts warning her of a potential ambush. But the scent was unmistakable, drawing her forward, overriding her fear. She pushed her way through the thicket, her fur snagging on thorns, her paws sinking into the soft earth. And then she saw him. He was lying on his side, his wolf form curled up in a ball, his dark fur matted with blood. He was breathing heavily, his body trembling, his eyes closed. He was injured.
Badly.
Lysandra rushed to his side, her heart pounding with fear and relief. She nudged him gently with her snout, whimpering softly, her wolf instincts urging him to wake up, to respond. He stirred, groaning softly, his golden eyes fluttering open. He looked at her, his gaze unfocused, confused, for a moment. Then, recognition dawned, and a faint smile touched his lips. Lysandra, he whispered, his voice weak, hoarse. She shifted back to her human form, kneeling beside him, her hands hovering over his wounds, unsure what to do, how to help. She saw a deep gash on his flank, still bleeding, and several smaller cuts and bruises on his legs and chest. "Caleb, what happened?" she asked, her voice trembling with concern. "Are you?" He coughed, a wet, rattling sound that sent a jolt of fear through her. "Hunter's dogs," he gasped, his voice barely audible. "Trap, silver bullet, silver." The word struck her like a physical blow. She knew from Caleb that silver was toxic to werewolves, causing severe burns, preventing healing, weakening their powers. A silver bullet, it could be fatal. She examined the wound on his flank more closely. It was deep, ragged, the edges blackened and inflamed. She could see the faint gleam of metal embedded within the flesh. The bullet. She knew she had to get it out, to cleanse the wound, to stop the bleeding. But she had no supplies, no herbs, no bandages, nothing but the blanket she was wearing and the moonfang at her side. She remembered the lessons Caleb had taught her, the knowledge of healing herbs she had gained from running her apothecary shop. She had to improvise, to use what she had, what she could find in the forest. "I'm going to help you," she said, her voice firm, determined, trying to mask the fear that was churning inside her. "I need to get the bullet out. It's going to hurt." He nodded weakly, his golden eyes filled with pain and trust. A trust that both humbled and terrified her. Lysandra ripped a strip of cloth from the blanket, using the moonfang to cut it. She then began searching the surrounding area, her eyes scanning the forest floor, her senses searching for the familiar sense of the herb she needed. She found yarrow, a plant known for its ability to stop bleeding, and comfrey, which promoted healing. She gathered the leaves, crushing them in her hands, releasing their potent aromas. She returned to Caleb's side, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. She knew this was a long shot, that she was no healer, that she lacked the experience and the knowledge of her grandmother.
But she had to try.
She had to save him. She gently cleaned the wound with water she gathered in a cupped leaf, her touch as gentle as she could manage, trying to ignore Caleb's winces of pain. She then applied the crushed herbs to the wound, pressing them firmly against the bleeding flesh. It was a slow, agonizing process, fraught with uncertainty and fear. But as she worked, as she tended to his wounds, as she felt his warm breath against her skin, a strange sense of calm descended upon her. She was no longer just a frightened woman, running for her life. She was a healer, a protector, a wolf. And she was not alone. She felt forbidden feelings, a mixture of compassion and affection. She felt love. And for the first time since her life had changed, she felt a flicker of hope. But it was short-lived. The sound of approaching footsteps shattered the quiet. Chapter 11. The Price of Protection. The sound of snapping twigs and rustling leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through Lysandra. She froze, her hand still pressed against Caleb's wound, her senses on high alert. The hunters. They had found them. Caleb, she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. We have to go. They're here. He groaned, his eyes fluttering open, his gaze unfocused. He tried to sit up, but a sharp intake of breath betrayed his pain. He was too weak, too injured to move, let alone run. Lysandra looked around frantically, her mind racing, searching for an escape route, a hiding place, anything that could offer them even a sliver of protection. But there was nothing. They were trapped, exposed, in the middle of the dense thicket, with no way out. She knew what she had to do. She had to protect him, even if it meant sacrificing herself. It was the only way. It was the promise she had made, the bond she had forged, the debt she owed. She shifted back to her wolf form, the change swift and seamless, her body responding instinctively to the threat. She stood over Caleb, shielding him with her body, her fur bristling, her teeth bared, ready to fight. The hunters emerged from the trees, 3 of them, their faces grim, their eyes hard, their weapons drawn. They were dressed in dark clothing, their movements silent and efficient, their expressions betraying a cold, ruthless determination. They carried rifles, crossbows, and knives, all glinting ominously in the dappled sunlight. And then she saw the dogs. 2 massive, muscular beasts, their fur black as night, their eyes glowing red, their jaws slavering, straining at their leashes. They were bred for hunting, for killing, their senses honed to track werewolves, their instincts programmed to attack. Lysandra growled, a low, guttural sound that resonated deep within her chest, a warning, a challenge, a promise of defiance. She would not go down without a fight. She would protect Caleb, even if it cost her her life. The hunters stopped, their eyes fixed on Lysandra, their expressions shifting from surprise to recognition. Well, one of them said, his voice a sneering drawl. Looks like we found our little lost sheep. And the wounded wolf she's been protecting. He stepped forward, his rifle raised, his finger on the trigger. It's over, Mutt. You can't run anymore. Lysandra tensed, her muscles coiled, ready to spring. She knew she was outmatched, outnumbered, that her chances of survival were slim. But she wouldn't surrender. She wouldn't let them take Caleb. Suddenly, a voice rang out, a voice filled with authority and rage. Leave her alone. It was Caleb. He had managed to struggle to his feet, his human form swaying unsteadily, his body covered in blood, his golden eyes blazing with a fierce, protective light. He was holding the moon fong, his grip weak but determined, the blade pointed towards the hunters. The hunters laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the forest. Look at this, another one said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. The big bad wolf is trying to play hero. Too bad he's too weak to even stand. He raised his crossbow, aiming at Caleb, his finger tightening on the trigger. Time to put you out of your misery. Lysandra saw the movement, the glint of the silver-tipped bolt, and reacted instinctively. She lunged forward, interposing herself between Caleb and the hunter, shielding him with her body. The bolt struck her, piercing her shoulder, the silver burning like fire, sending a wave of agonizing pain through her. She cried out a sharp, yelping sound, but she didn't fall. She stood her ground, her body trembling, her teeth bared, her eyes fixed on the hunter, daring him to try again. Caleb stared at her, his eyes wide with horror and admiration. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against her fur, his touch sending a jolt of warmth through her. "Lysandra," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. No, the hunters were momentarily stunned by Lysandra's actions, by her courage, her selflessness. But their surprise quickly turned to anger, to a renewed determination to kill. "Fine," the first hunter said, his voice cold and hard. "We'll just kill them both." He signaled to the others, and they raised their weapons, ready to fire. Lysandra braced herself, her body tensed, prepared for the inevitable. She closed her eyes, her last thought a silent prayer for Caleb, a wish that he would somehow survive, that he would live to see another day. But the shots never came. Instead, a new sound filled the air, a sound that made the hunters freeze, their faces paling with fear. A chorus of howls, deep, resonant, terrifying, echoing through the forest, growing closer, louder, surrounding them. The pack had arrived. Lysandra opened her eyes, her heart leaping with hope. She saw them then, emerging from the trees, dozens of wolves, their fur the colors of shadow and moonlight, their eyes glowing with a fierce, protective light. They were led by a massive alpha, his fur pure black, his eyes burning with an ancient power. The hunters were outnumbered, outmatched, surrounded. They lowered their weapons, their faces etched with terror, their bodies trembling. The alpha stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Lysandra, his eyes filled with recognition and approval. He nudged her gently with his snout, a silent acknowledgement, a gesture of acceptance. Then, he turned his attention to the hunters, his growl a low, rumbling threat that sent shivers down their spines. He spoke, his voice a deep, resonant command that echoed through the forest, his words clear even in their animalistic language.
"Leave. Now."
And never return. He let loose another howl, and the forest seemed to shrink back, or face the consequences. The hunters didn't hesitate. They turned and fled, disappearing into the trees, their dogs whimpering at their heels, their fear palpable in the air. The price, Lysandra would later reflect, had been high.
But for now.
The alpha turned his gaze, back to Lysandra, and then to Caleb. Chapter 12. Beneath a canopy of stars. The alpha, a magnificent creature with fur as black as midnight and eyes that held the wisdom of ages, approached Caleb. Lysandra remained in her wolf form, standing protectively beside him, her body still trembling from the aftershocks of the silver bolt. She watched, her senses alert, as the alpha sniffed Caleb, assessing his injuries, his scent, his worthiness. The air crackled with unspoken tension, a silent communication passing between the two wolves, a test of dominance, of acceptance, of pack hierarchy. Lysandra felt a pang of anxiety, a fear that Caleb, weakened and injured, might be rejected, challenged, even killed. But the alpha, after a long, tense moment, simply nodded, a subtle gesture of acknowledgement, of acceptance. He then turned his attention to Lysandra, his gaze intense, piercing, scrutinizing. He circled her slowly, sniffing her fur, his eyes lingering on the wound on her shoulder, the mark on her wrist. He stopped in front of her, his massive head close to hers, his breath warm on her fur. He let out a low rumble, a sound that vibrated deep within her chest, a sound that spoke of power, of authority, of kinship. He then nudged her gently towards Caleb, a silent command, an invitation, a blessing. He was accepting them both. Into the pack. Into his protection. Lysandra shifted back to her human form, her body aching, her shoulder throbbing with pain. She looked at Caleb, his human form still weak and unsteady, his golden eyes filled with relief and gratitude. He reached out a trembling hand, his fingers brushing against hers, sending a jolt of warmth through her. He smiled, a weak, tired smile, but a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that spoke of a shared ordeal, a bond forged in danger, a connection that transcended words. The other wolves, still in their animal forms, gathered around them, their presence comforting, protective, a silent welcome into their fold. They were a diverse group, their fur ranging in color from shades of gray and brown to black and white, their eyes reflecting the moonlight, their bodies radiating a sense of power, of unity, of belonging. The alpha shifted back to his human form, revealing a tall, imposing man with long, silver hair and a face etched with the lines of age and experience. He wore simple, leather clothing, his body lean and muscular, his movements graceful and deliberate. He carried an aura of authority, of command, but there was also a kindness in his eyes, a warmth that put Lysandra at ease. "Welcome," he said, his voice deep and resonant, echoing through the clearing. "To the Shadowclaw Pack. I am Kalen, the Alpha." He gestured towards the other wolves, who were now shifting back to their human forms, revealing a diverse group of men and women, young and old, all with the same striking golden eyes, the mark of their lycanthropy. "We have been watching you," Kalen continued, his gaze fixed on Lysandra and Caleb. "We have been waiting for you. We knew you would come." He explained that Caleb had contacted them years ago, after meeting Lysandra's grandmother, after learning about the prophecy, about Lysandra's hidden heritage. He had made a pact with them, a promise to protect her, to guide her, to bring her to them when the time was right. "The hunters have been searching for you for a long time, Lysandra," Kalen said, his voice grave. "They fear your power, your lineage. They will not stop until they have eliminated you." He paused, his gaze shifting to Caleb. "But you're safe now. You are under our protection. You are one of us." He then addressed Caleb, his voice filled with concern. "You are injured. We need to tend to your wounds." He gestured towards two members of the pack, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile, and a young man with a strong, sturdy build. They approached Caleb, their movements swift and efficient, and began to examine his injuries. Lysandra watched, her heart filled with a mixture of relief and gratitude. She was safe. Caleb was safe. They were surrounded by their own kind, by a pack that would protect them, guide them, accept them. But she also felt a sense of unease, of uncertainty. She was still new to this world, to this life, to her own powers. She had so much to learn, so much to understand. As the pack members tended to Caleb's wounds, Kalen turned his attention back to Lysandra. He examined the wound on her shoulder, the silver burn still raw and painful. "We need to remove the remaining silver," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "and cleanse the wound. It will be painful, but it must be done." He led her towards a small stream that flowed nearby, its water clear and cold. He instructed her to sit down, and then he began to work, his touch surprisingly gentle, his movements precise and skilled. He used a small, sharp knife to remove the remaining fragments of silver from her flesh, each extraction sending a jolt of searing pain through her. Lysandra gritted her teeth, her body trembling, but she didn't cry out. She would endure. She would be strong. After the silver was removed, Kalen washed the wound with the cold stream water, cleansing it of blood and debris. He then applied a poultice of herbs, their scent familiar and comforting, reminding her of her apothecary shop, of her old life, a life that now seemed so distant, so unreal. As he worked, he spoke to her, his voice low and soothing, explaining the ways of the pack, the history of their people, the challenges they faced, the responsibilities they carried. He told her about the ancient conflict between werewolves and hunters, a war that had been raging for centuries, a war that had shaped their lives, their culture, their very existence. He spoke of the importance of loyalty, of unity, of protecting their own, of preserving their heritage. He also spoke of the prophecy, the one that Caleb had mentioned, the one that spoke of a powerful werewolf, a descendant of the Vale lineage, who would rise to lead them, to unite the scattered packs, to bring an end to the war. Lysandra listened, her mind reeling, her heart filled with a mixture of awe and fear. She was just an ordinary woman, a small-town apothecary, thrust into a world she didn't understand, burdened with a destiny she didn't ask for. As the sun began to set, casting long, golden rays through the trees, Kaelin finished tending to her wound. He bandaged it with a strip of cloth, his touch lingering for a moment, his eyes meeting hers. "You are strong, Lysandra," he said, his voice filled with respect. "You have the spirit of a wolf, the heart of a healer, the blood of a leader." He paused, his gaze searching hers. "You have much to learn, much to experience. But you are not alone. We will guide you. We will teach you. We will help you fulfill your destiny." He stood up, his tall, imposing figure silhouetted against the setting sun. He gestured towards the other pack members, who were now gathered around a large fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. "Come," he said, his voice inviting. "Join us. Let us celebrate your arrival, your survival, your becoming." Lysandra followed him, her body still aching, her spirit weary, but her heart filled with a tentative flicker of hope. She was surrounded by her own kind, by a pack that had accepted her, protected her, welcomed her into their fold. As she sat by the fire, beneath the canopy of stars, surrounded by the warmth and camaraderie of the Shadowclaw pack, listening to their stories, their laughter, their songs, she felt a sense of belonging, a sense of peace she had never known before. She looked across the fire at Caleb. He was sitting up, leaning against a tree, his wounds bandaged, his face pale but his golden eyes shining with a warmth. He smiled at her, a true smile. And, in that moment she knew. She would make it. But the peace was broken. The quiet interrupted. A scout returned, panting, breathless, his eyes wide with fear. "They're coming," he gasped. "An army of them. Hunters. More than we've ever seen." Chapter 13. Secrets in the Ancient Woods. The news struck like a thunderclap, shattering the fragile peace that had settled over the pack. An army of hunters. More than they had ever seen. The words echoed in Lysandra's mind, a terrifying confirmation of the danger they faced, of the relentless pursuit that would not cease until they were all dead. Fear rippled through the gathering, a palpable wave of anxiety and dread. Faces that had been filled with laughter and camaraderie were now etched with worry, with grim determination, with the cold, hard reality of war. Kaelin, his face a mask of steely resolve, rose to his feet, his voice ringing out with authority, cutting through the rising murmur of fear. "We will fight," he declared, his golden eyes sweeping over the assembled pack members. "We will defend our territory, our lives, our way of life. We will not be hunted. We will not be driven into hiding. We will stand our ground." His words, though filled with courage and defiance, did little to quell the underlying fear. Lysandra felt it herself, a cold knot in her stomach, a tightening in her chest. She was still new to this world, still learning to control her powers, still grappling with the reality of her transformation. She was not a warrior, not a fighter, not a leader. But she knew she had to be. She had to find the strength within herself, the courage she didn't know she possessed, to face this threat, to protect her pack, to protect Caleb. She looked across the fire at him, his face pale but determined, his golden eyes meeting hers, a silent communication passing between them, a promise of support, of solidarity, of shared destiny. Kaelin began issuing orders, his voice calm and decisive, assigning roles, deploying his pack members, preparing for battle. He divided them into groups, assigning each group a specific task, a strategic position, a defensive maneuver. He spoke of tactics, of strategies, of using the terrain to their advantage, of exploiting the hunter's weaknesses. He then turned to Lysandra, his gaze intense, his voice softening slightly. "You will stay with me," he said. "You are not yet ready to fight. But you can help. You have knowledge of healing, of herbs, of other things. He paused, his eyes searching hers, as if trying to decipher a hidden truth, a secret she herself didn't yet understand. Your grandmother, he continued, his voice low and filled with a hint of awe. She was a powerful woman, a seer, a witch. She possessed knowledge of ancient magic, of forgotten lore. You carry her blood, Lysandra. You may have inherited her gifts. His words sent a shiver down Lysandra's spine. A witch? Magic? It sounded like something out of a fairy tale, something she had always dismissed as fantasy, as superstition. But in this world, in this reality, where werewolves roamed the forests and hunters stalked their prey, anything seemed possible. She remembered the books in Caleb's cabin, the leather-bound volumes filled with strange symbols and cryptic writings. She remembered the feeling she had when she touched the moonfang, the sense of connection, of power, of recognition. Could it be true? Could she possess some hidden ability, some latent power that could help them in this fight? Kaelin led her away from the fire, towards a small, secluded grove hidden deep within the ancient woods. The trees here were older, taller, their branches intertwined, forming a dense canopy that blocked out the moonlight, creating an atmosphere of mystery, of secrecy, of magic. He stopped in the center of the grove, before a large, moss-covered stone, its surface carved with strange symbols, similar to the ones on the moonfang, on the mark on her wrist. "This is a place of power," Kaelin said, his voice reverent. "A place where the veil between worlds is thin. A place where your grandmother used to commune with the spirits, draw upon the ancient energies, perform her rituals." He gestured towards the stone. "Touch it, Lysandra. Close your eyes. Focus your mind. See if you can feel anything." Lysandra hesitated, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She didn't know what to expect, what she was supposed to feel, what she was even capable of. But she trusted Kaelin. She trusted her instincts. She trusted the faint, flickering hope that she might possess some hidden ability that could help them. She stepped forward, her hand trembling slightly, and placed her palm against the cold, rough surface of the stone. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to clear her mind, to focus her thoughts, to open herself to whatever might come. At first, she felt nothing. Just the coldness of the stone, the silence of the grove, the fear that still gnawed at her insides. But then, slowly, gradually, she began to sense something else. A faint tingling in her fingertips, a warmth spreading through her hand, a subtle vibration in the air. She felt a connection, a resonance, a sense of power. Images flashed through her mind, fleeting and fragmented, visions of the past, of her grandmother, of the hunters, of the coming battle. She saw faces, symbols, patterns, a chaotic jumble of information that she couldn't quite decipher, couldn't quite understand. But she felt something deep within her, stirring, awakening, responding to the ancient magic of this place. She felt a connection to her heritage, to her grandmother, to the power that flowed through her blood. She opened her eyes, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling with the effort. She looked at Kaelin, his face filled with a mixture of hope and amazement. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice urgent. "What did you feel?" Lysandra struggled to find the words, to describe the overwhelming sensory overload she had just experienced. I don't know," she stammered. "Images, visions, feelings. I saw the hunters. They're planning something. Something big." She touched the stone again, the symbols sparking something. "There's a ritual," she said, her voice gaining strength. "They're going to use a ritual to enhance their powers, to make them stronger." Kaelin's eyes widened, his face paling with alarm. "A ritual?" he repeated, his voice filled with dread. "What kind of ritual? Where? When?" Lysandra closed her eyes again, focusing, trying to recapture the fleeting images, to piece together the fragmented information. I don't know," she said, her voice frustrated. "It was unclear, but I saw a place, an old church, on a hill." Overlooking the town, she gasped, her eyes snapping open, her mind suddenly clear, her memory flooding back. "St. Jude's," she whispered, her voice filled with horror. "The church where I was found. The hunters are going to perform the ritual there." The revelation was a devastating blow. The ancient church held a secret, and that secret was about to be unearthed. Chapter 14. The Unveiling of Lycanthropy. The revelation that the hunters were planning to perform a ritual at St. Jude's, the very church where Lysandra had been found as a baby, sent a shockwave through the pack. It was a deliberate provocation, a calculated insult, a desecration of a place that held a deep, personal significance for Lysandra and a potential strategic advantage for the hunters. Kalen wasted no time. He immediately ordered a scouting party to investigate the church, to confirm Lysandra's vision, to gather intelligence on the hunters' plans, their numbers, their defenses. He also began to prepare the rest of the pack for a possible confrontation, knowing that they might have to fight to protect the church, to prevent the hunters from completing their ritual, to defend their very existence. Lysandra, despite her lack of combat experience, insisted on joining the scouting party. She felt a deep, personal connection to St. Jude's, a need to understand the secrets it held, a desire to confront the hunters on the very ground where her life had begun, where her destiny had been set in motion. Caleb, despite his injuries, also insisted on going with her. He was still weak, still recovering, but his determination to protect Lysandra, to stand by her side, overrode his pain, his physical limitations. Kalen, recognizing the bond between them, the strength of their connection, reluctantly agreed. He assigned 2 other experienced wolves to accompany them, to provide support, to ensure their safety. They traveled under the cloak of darkness, moving swiftly and silently through the forest, their senses on high alert, their bodies tense with anticipation. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the landscape in an eerie, inky blackness, making their journey even more perilous, more unsettling. As they approached Ashen Ridge, Lysandra felt a strange mix of emotions, a blend of fear, nostalgia, and anger. She hadn't been back since the night of her transformation, since she had fled her old life, since she had become a werewolf. She wondered what had become of her cottage, her apothecary shop, the townsfolk she had known, the life she had left behind. They reached the outskirts of the town, the familiar sights and sounds triggering a flood of memories, a pang of longing for the simplicity, the normalcy, the innocence she had lost. But she pushed those feelings aside, focusing on the task at hand, on the danger they faced, on the mission they had to accomplish. They approached St. Jude's cautiously, staying hidden in the shadows, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement, any hint of the hunter's presence. The church stood on a small hill overlooking the town, its ancient stone walls silhouetted against the night sky, its stained glass windows dark and empty, its steeple pointing towards the heavens like a silent, accusing finger. It looked deserted, peaceful, innocent. But Lysandra knew better. She could feel the darkness lurking within, the malevolent energy emanating from the hunters, the threat they posed, the ritual they were planning. They circled the church, staying hidden in the shadows, their senses straining to detect any sign of activity. They found no guards, no sentries, no outward indication of the hunter's presence. It was eerily quiet, unsettlingly calm. Caleb, his voice a low whisper, spoke to Lysandra. "They're inside," he said, his golden eyes gleaming in the darkness. "I can smell them. And something else. Something powerful. Something dark." Lysandra nodded, her own senses confirming his words. She could feel it too, a heavy, oppressive presence, a sense of foreboding, a darkness that seemed to emanate from the very stones of the church. They decided to enter the church, to investigate, to confirm Lysandra's vision, to gather more information. They found a small, unlocked side door, hidden in the shadows, and slipped inside, their movements silent and stealthy. The interior of the church was dark and silent, the air thick with the scent of dust, old wood, and incense. The moonlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting eerie, colored patterns on the stone floor, illuminating the rows of empty pews, the altar at the front, the crucifix hanging above. They moved cautiously, their senses on high alert, their bodies tense, ready for anything. They reached the main sanctuary, the large, open space where the congregation would normally gather. And that's when they saw it. In the center of the sanctuary, directly in front of the altar, a circle had been drawn on the floor, a large, intricate design made of salt and blood. Within the circle, candles were burning, casting a flickering, unholy light, illuminating a collection of strange objects, bones, feathers, herbs, and a book. A large, leather-bound book, its pages filled with symbols and writings, similar to the ones Lysandra had seen in Caleb's cabin, in her grandmother's cabin, on the stone in the ancient woods. It was the ritual. They were preparing to perform it. Lysandra felt a surge of anger, of revulsion, of recognition. She had seen this before, in her vision, in her grandmother's books, in the depths of her own subconscious. It was an ancient ritual, a dark magic, designed to enhance the hunter's powers, to make them stronger, faster, more resilient, to give them an advantage over their werewolf prey. Caleb, his voice a low growl, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the book. "We have to stop them," he said, his voice filled with a fierce determination. "We have to destroy the book." But as he moved towards the circle, a voice rang out, a cold, sneering voice that echoed through the silent church. "I wouldn't do that if I were you, Wolf." The hunters emerged from the shadows, stepping out from behind the pillars, from the hidden alcoves, from the darkness that had concealed them. They were numerous, more than Lysandra had anticipated, and they were armed, their weapons glinting in the candlelight, their faces grim and determined. And leading them, standing in the center of the circle, holding the book in his hands, was a man Lysandra had never seen before, but recognized instantly. He was tall, thin, his face pale and gaunt, his eyes cold and black, his hair long and silver, similar to Kalen's, but devoid of any warmth, any kindness. He wore a long, dark robe, embroidered with strange symbols, and he carried an aura of power, of darkness, of familiarity. He stared directly at Lysandra and spoke one name. "Lysandra Vale," he said, and his voice was like the rasping of dry bones.
Or should I say,
Granddaughter. Chapter 15. A love bathed in blood. The word granddaughter struck Lysandra like a physical blow, stealing her breath, sending a wave of shock and disbelief through her. This man, this hunter, this embodiment of darkness and cruelty, was claiming to be her grandfather? It was impossible, unthinkable, a lie designed to unnerve her, to break her, to exploit her deepest vulnerabilities. But as she looked at him, at his face, his eyes, his features, she saw a chilling resemblance, a faint echo of her own features, of her grandmother's features, a connection that she couldn't deny, couldn't ignore. It was a horrifying truth, a revelation that shattered her understanding of her past, of her identity, of everything she thought she knew. "You're lying," she stammered, her voice trembling, her mind reeling. "My grandfather, he's dead. He died before I was born." The man smiled, a cruel, mocking smile that didn't reach his eyes.
did he now?
"That's what they told you, isn't it? That's what they wanted you to believe. But I'm very much alive, Lysandra. And I've been waiting for you. For a very long time." He held up the book, its leather cover gleaming in the candlelight, its pages filled with ancient symbols and cryptic writings. "This book," he said, his voice dripping with a perverse pride, "contains the secrets of our family, Lysandra. The secrets of our power. The secrets of our curse." He paused, his gaze shifting to Caleb, his eyes narrowing with hatred and contempt. "And you," he said, his voice a low growl, "you are the one who has been interfering with my plans. The one who has been protecting her. The one who has been corrupting her." Caleb stepped forward, his body tense, his golden eyes blazing with defiance. "She is not yours to control," he said, his voice firm and unwavering. "She is free. She is one of us. She is mine." The word mine hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning, a declaration of love, of possession, of a bond that transcended the conflict that surrounded them, the danger that threatened to consume them. Lysandra felt a surge of warmth, of gratitude, of reciprocation. She loved him too, she realized, with a depth and intensity that she had never known before, a love that had blossomed in the midst of darkness and fear, a love that was both forbidden and inevitable. The hunter, her grandfather, laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the church. "Yours?" he sneered. "You think you can claim her? You think you can protect her? You are nothing but a mutt, a beast, a creature of the night. She is destined for more than that. She is destined to join me, to embrace her true heritage, to fulfill her destiny." He turned back to Lysandra, his eyes filled with a twisted, manipulative affection. "Come, my dear," he said, his voice softening, becoming almost seductive. "Join me. Embrace your power. Let us cleanse the world of these abominations. Let us restore our family to its rightful place." He extended a hand towards her, a gesture of invitation, of temptation, of corruption. Lysandra hesitated, her mind torn between the horror of his words, the revulsion she felt for him, and the faint, flickering pull of her blood, of her heritage, of the secrets he held, the power he offered. She looked at Caleb, his face etched with worry, with love, with a desperate plea for her to choose the right path, to reject the darkness, to embrace the light. She made her decision. "Never," she said, her voice firm and clear, her eyes filled with defiance. "I will never join you. I will never betray my pack. I will never betray him." She stepped forward, standing beside Caleb, her hand reaching for his, their fingers intertwining, their bond strengthening, their love a shield against the darkness that surrounded them. The hunter's smile vanished, replaced by a mask of fury, of hatred, of disappointment. "So be it," he said, his voice cold and hard.
"Then you will die.
Both of you." He raised his hand, signaling to the other hunters, and they attacked. The church erupted in chaos, a maelstrom of violence and bloodshed. The hunters charged, their weapons flashing, their shouts echoing through the sanctuary. The werewolves fought back, their claws and teeth tearing at flesh, their growls and snarls filling the air. Lysandra, despite her lack of combat experience, fought with a ferocity she didn't know she possessed, fueled by her love for Caleb, her loyalty to her pack, her determination to survive. She used the moonfang, its blades swift and deadly, deflecting blows, striking at exposed flesh, protecting herself and Caleb. Caleb fought like a demon, his injuries forgotten, his strength fueled by adrenaline and rage. He moved with a speed and agility that belied his weakened state, tearing through the hunters, protecting Lysandra, his love for her a beacon in the darkness. The battle raged, a brutal, bloody dance of death, the outcome uncertain, the stakes impossibly high. Lysandra saw pack members fall, their bodies torn and broken, their lives extinguished. She saw hunters fall, their screams of pain and terror echoing through the church. She fought on, her body aching, her spirit weary, but her resolve unbroken. She would not give up. She would not surrender. She would fight until her last breath. She saw her grandfather, standing in the center of the circle, chanting, his voice rising in power, the symbols on the floor glowing with an unholy light. He was performing the ritual, drawing upon the ancient magic, enhancing his own powers and the powers of his hunters. Lysandra knew she had to stop him. She had to destroy the book, to break the circle, to disrupt the ritual. It was their only chance. She fought her way towards him, dodging blows, deflecting attacks, her eyes fixed on her target, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She reached the edge of the circle, her body battered and bruised, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She raised the moonfang, ready to strike, to destroy the book, to end this nightmare. But her grandfather was faster. He saw her coming, his eyes narrowing with hatred, and he raised his hand, unleashing a blast of dark energy, a force that struck Lysandra with the power of a battering ram, throwing her backwards, sending her crashing to the floor. She lay there, dazed, her body numb, her vision blurred. She saw her grandfather standing over her, his face twisted with triumph, his hand raised, ready to deliver the final blow. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable, her last thought a silent farewell to Caleb, a wish that he would somehow survive, that he would live to see a world without this darkness. But the blow never came. Instead, she heard a roar, a sound of pure rage, of primal fury, of desperate love. She opened her eyes and saw Caleb, leaping through the air, his body a blur of motion, his claws extended, his teeth bared. He struck her grandfather, knocking him off balance, sending him sprawling to the floor, the book flying from his grasp. Caleb landed beside Lysandra, his body shielding hers, his golden eyes blazing with a protective light. He growled a low, guttural sound that promised retribution, that warned of the consequences of harming his mate. The battle continued to rage and, with the ritual broken, the tide was turning. The hunters started to show signs of exhaustion. But Lysandra looked at the book, the source. She had to get to it. Chapter 16. Betrayal's Bitter Sting. Lysandra, ignoring the throbbing pain in her body, scrambled towards the fallen book. It lay open on the cold stone floor, its pages illuminated by the flickering candlelight, the ancient symbols seeming to writhe and twist before her eyes. She knew she had to destroy it, to sever the connection to the dark magic it contained, to prevent her grandfather from using it again. But as she reached for it, a hand clamped down on her wrist, a grip of steel, preventing her from touching the book. She looked up, her heart sinking, her hope turning to ashes. It wasn't her grandfather. It was Kalen. His golden eyes, usually filled with kindness and authority, were now cold and hard, devoid of any warmth, any recognition. His face was a mask of grim determination, his expression betraying a secret he had kept hidden, a truth that now shattered Lysandra's world. Kalen? She gasped, her voice filled with disbelief and confusion. What are you doing? He didn't answer, his grip tightening on her wrist, his strength overwhelming. He pulled her away from the book, towards the center of the circle, towards her grandfather. The hunter, who had managed to regain his footing, was smiling, a cruel, triumphant smile that sent a chill down Lysandra's spine. "Excellent work, Kalen," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction. "You have proven your loyalty. You have delivered her to me." Lysandra's mind reeled, struggling to comprehend the reality of what was happening. Kalen, the alpha of the Shadowclaw pack, the man who had welcomed her, protected her, guided her, was a traitor? He had been working with the hunters all along? It was impossible, unthinkable, a betrayal that cut deeper than any physical wound. Caleb, who had been fighting off several hunters, saw what was happening and roared in fury, his eyes blazing with rage and disbelief. He charged towards Kalen, his claws extended, his teeth bared, ready to tear him apart. But Kalen was too fast, too strong. He anticipated Caleb's attack, sidestepping with ease, and then struck, his fist connecting with Caleb's jaw, sending him sprawling to the floor. "Stay back, Caleb," Kalen said, his voice cold and commanding. "This doesn't concern you. This is a family matter." He turned back to Lysandra, his grip still tight on her wrist. "You see, Lysandra," he said, his voice softening slightly, becoming almost paternal. "I have always been loyal to your grandfather. I have always been working for him. He is the true alpha, the rightful leader of our kind. He is the one who will restore us to our former glory, who will lead us to victory over the humans." He paused, his gaze shifting to the book, his eyes filled with a fanatic zeal. "This ritual," he continued, "it is the key. It will give us the power we need to crush our enemies, to cleanse the world of their filth, to create a new order, a world ruled by werewolves." Lysandra stared at him, her heart breaking, her mind numb with shock and betrayal. She couldn't believe what she was hearing, what she was seeing. Kalen, the man she had trusted, the man she had respected, the man she had considered a friend, was a monster, a traitor, a fanatic.
But why?
She whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Why would you do this? Why would you betray your own pack? Why would you betray me? Kalen's expression hardened, his eyes losing any semblance of warmth. You were a means to an end, Lysandra, he said, his voice cold and dismissive. A pawn in a larger game. Your grandfather needed you, your power, your lineage, to complete the ritual. I was simply ensuring that you fulfilled your destiny. He gestured towards her grandfather, who was now standing beside him, his hand resting on Kalen's shoulder, a gesture of approval, of ownership. Join us, Lysandra, Kalen said, his voice becoming almost pleading. Embrace your true heritage. Embrace your power. Become what you were meant to be. Lysandra looked from Kalen to her grandfather, her heart filled with a mixture of rage, sorrow, and disgust. She had been betrayed, manipulated, used. But she would not be broken. She would not surrender. She would not join them. Never, she said, her voice firm and clear, her eyes blazing with defiance. I will never be like you. I will never betray my friends. I will never betray myself. She wrenched her wrist free from Kalen's grip, her sudden movement catching him off guard. She stumbled back, away from him, away from her grandfather, away from the darkness that threatened to consume her. She looked around, her eyes searching for Caleb, for her pack members, for any sign of hope, of support, of resistance. But the battle had turned against them. The hunters, bolstered by Kalen's betrayal, by the power of the partially completed ritual, had gained the upper hand. Many of the werewolves were dead, their bodies scattered across the floor, their lives extinguished. Others were wounded, struggling to fight, their strength fading. Caleb was still alive, but he was surrounded by hunters, his body battered and bruised, his movements slow and labored. He was fighting with a desperate courage, a fierce determination, but he was losing. Lysandra knew she had to do something, anything, to help him, to save what was left of her pack. But she felt helpless, powerless, overwhelmed by the betrayal, by the darkness, by the sheer scale of the forces arrayed against them. She looked at the book, still lying open on the floor, its pages glowing with an unholy light. It was the source of their power, the key to their victory. She had to destroy it, even if it meant risking her own life. She took a deep breath, steeling her resolve, preparing to make a final, desperate stand. She would not go down without a fight. She would not let them win. She would fight for Caleb, for her pack, for her own soul. As she prepared to lunge forward, toward the book, she heard a shout. A new voice, clear and strong. Stop. The voice was female, and Lysandra felt a faint flicker of something. Kalen, you will cease this madness. The fighting, however, did not stop. Chapter 17. The Heart's Reckoning. The voice, though powerful, was initially lost in the din of battle, the clash of steel, the snarls of werewolves, the shouts of hunters. But it persisted, rising above the chaos, demanding attention, carrying an authority that even Kalen couldn't ignore. I said stop. The fighting gradually subsided, the combatants pausing, their weapons lowered, their attention drawn to the source of the command. Lysandra turned, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and trepidation, her eyes searching for the speaker. And then she saw her. Standing at the entrance of the church, silhouetted against the night sky, was a woman. She was tall and slender, her body radiating a sense of power, of grace, of familiarity. She wore simple, practical clothing, similar to what Lysandra herself wore, but there was an air of authority about her, a confidence that commanded respect. Her hair was long and silver, like Kalen's, like her grandfather's, but it was streaked with strands of dark, vibrant color, a reminder of a youth that hadn't faded, a spirit that hadn't been broken. Her eyes, though not the golden hue of a werewolf, were sharp and intelligent, filled with a mixture of anger, sorrow, and determination. Lysandra felt a strange connection to this woman, a sense of recognition, a feeling that she had seen her before, in her dreams, in her visions, in the depths of her own subconscious. Kaelin, his face paling, his expression shifting from defiance to fear, took a step back, his hand instinctively reaching for the hilt of his sword. "Mother?" he whispered, his voice filled with disbelief and confusion. What are you doing here? Mother?" Lysandra's mind reeled. This woman was Kaelin's mother? But that would mean she was also a werewolf? But her eyes, they weren't golden. They were human. The woman, Kaelin's mother, stepped forward, her gaze fixed on her son, her expression filled with a profound sadness, a deep disappointment. "I came to stop you, Kaelin," she said, her voice firm and clear, resonating through the silent church. "I came to stop this madness, this bloodshed, this betrayal. I came to remind you of who you are, of what you were meant to be." She paused, her gaze shifting to Lysandra, her eyes softening slightly, filled with a mixture of compassion and apology. "And I came to apologize," she continued, her voice choked with emotion. "To you, Lysandra, for the pain, the suffering, the lies that have been inflicted upon you.
For the sins of my family."
She turned back to Kaelin, her expression hardening, her voice becoming filled with steel. "You have strayed from the path, Kaelin," she said. "You have been seduced by the darkness, by the false promises of power, by the twisted ideology of your grandfather." She gestured towards the hunter, Lysandra's grandfather, who was standing beside the circle, his face a mask of fury, of hatred, of fear. He knew that this woman, this unexpected arrival, posed a threat to his plans, to his power, to his very existence. "He is not your leader, Kaelin," she continued, her voice ringing with authority. "He is a monster, a manipulator, a destroyer. He cares nothing for you, for the pack, for anyone but himself. He is using you, just as he used your father." Kaelin's face crumpled, his expression shifting from defiance to anguish. He looked from his mother to his grandfather, his mind torn between loyalty and doubt, between love and betrayal, between the darkness he had embraced and the light he had rejected. "It's not true," he whispered, his voice filled with a desperate plea for reassurance. He told me, he promised me." His mother stepped closer, her hand reaching out to him, a gesture of compassion, of forgiveness, of love. "He lied, Kaelin," she said softly. "He always lies. He twists the truth, manipulates the facts, exploits the vulnerabilities of others. He is a master of deception, a weaver of illusions, a predator." She paused, her gaze locking onto his, her eyes filled with a profound sadness. "I know this because I was once his victim too." She revealed then the story of her past, a story of love and betrayal, of manipulation and abuse, of a young woman seduced by a charming, charismatic man who turned out to be a monster, a hunter, a leader of a dark and twisted sect. She had fallen in love with him, married him, borne him a son, Kaelin. But she had eventually discovered the truth about him, his true nature, his cruel intentions, his plans to use her, to use their son, to further his own twisted agenda. She had fled, taking Kaelin with her, hiding him from his father, raising him in secret, teaching him the ways of the werewolves, the importance of compassion, of loyalty, of protecting the innocent. She had hoped that she had saved him, that she had shielded him from his father's influence, that she had taught him to choose the right path. But she had failed. Her son, Kaelin, driven by a deep-seated need for his father's approval, by a longing for a family he had never known, by a twisted sense of loyalty, had secretly sought out his grandfather, had embraced his dark ideology, had become his pawn, his tool, his betrayer. Lysandra listened, her heart aching for this woman, for her pain, her suffering, her courage, her resilience. She saw in her a reflection of herself, a woman betrayed, manipulated, used, but who had refused to be broken, who had fought for what she believed in, who had chosen love over hate, light over darkness. As the story unfolded, Caleb, who had managed to regain his footing, moved to Lysandra's side, his hand reaching for hers, their fingers intertwining, their bond strengthening, their love a beacon of hope in the midst of this devastating revelation. Kaelin, his face pale and stricken, his eyes filled with tears, finally broke. He fell to his knees, his body shaking with sobs, his heart shattered by the truth, by the weight of his betrayal, by the realization of what he had done. "Mother, I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice choked with remorse. "I didn't know, I didn't understand, I was wrong." His mother knelt beside him, embracing him, holding him close, her tears mingling with his, a silent forgiveness, a bond of love that even the darkest betrayal couldn't completely erase. The hunters, seeing their leader broken, their ritual disrupted, their plans thwarted, began to lose their nerve, their courage faltering, their determination crumbling. They looked to Lysandra's grandfather for guidance, for leadership, for a way out of this disastrous situation. But he was silent, his face a mask of fury and frustration, his eyes fixed on Lysandra, his gaze filled with a burning hatred, a desperate longing for revenge. He knew he had lost. He knew it was over. But he wouldn't surrender. He wouldn't be taken alive. Chapter 18. Facing the Alpha's Wrath. Lysandra's grandfather, his plans in ruins, his power diminished, his control shattered, stood alone in the center of the desecrated church, a figure of isolated fury and fading dominance. He knew he was defeated, but his pride, his arrogance, his ingrained hatred for werewolves prevented him from surrendering, from accepting his fate. He looked at Lysandra, his eyes burning with a malevolent intensity, a final, desperate attempt to inflict pain, to leave a lasting scar, to deny her any semblance of victory. "You may have won this battle, granddaughter," he hissed, his voice raspy and filled with venom. "But you will never win the war. The hunters will never stop. They will hunt you, your pack, your lover, until the last werewolf is eradicated from this earth." He paused, his gaze shifting to Caleb, his eyes narrowing with a particular hatred, a personal vendetta. "And you," he said, his voice dripping with contempt, "you will suffer the most. I will make sure of it. I will hunt you down. I will torture you. I will make you watch as I destroy everything you hold dear." His words were a curse, a threat, a final act of defiance, a desperate attempt to maintain some semblance of control, of power, in the face of his imminent demise. But Lysandra refused to be intimidated, to be cowed, to be broken. She had faced too much, endured too much, overcome too much to be swayed by his empty threats, his hollow pronouncements. "You have no power over me," she said, her voice firm and clear, her eyes filled with a newfound strength, a confidence that had been forged in the crucible of betrayal and loss. "You are nothing but a bitter, old man, clinging to a past that is gone, a future that will never be. Your hatred, your violence, your cruelty, it ends here.
Today."
She stepped forward, standing tall and proud, her hand still intertwined with Caleb's, their bond a symbol of their love, their unity, their defiance against the darkness he represented. Her grandfather laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the silent church, a sound devoid of any humor, any joy, any humanity. "You think so?" he sneered. "You think you have defeated me? You are wrong, Lysandra. You have only delayed the inevitable. The darkness will always return. The hunt will always continue. And you will always be haunted by your heritage." He reached inside his robe, his hand disappearing into the folds of fabric, his eyes never leaving Lysandra's, his expression a mixture of hatred and anticipation. Lysandra tensed, her instincts screaming at her, warning her of imminent danger. She knew he was about to do something desperate, something final. And then she saw it. A glint of silver, a flash of metal, a small, curved blade, emerging from his hand. A dagger, coated in a dark, viscous substance.
Poison.
He lunged forward, his movements surprisingly swift for a man of his age, his eyes fixed on Lysandra, his intent clear. To kill her, to end her life, to deliver one last, devastating blow. But Caleb was faster. He reacted instinctively, shoving Lysandra aside, interposing himself between her and her grandfather, taking the full force of the attack. The dagger plunged into his side, piercing his flesh, the poisoned blade sinking deep into his body. Caleb gasped, a sharp intake of breath, his body shuddering with pain, his golden eyes widening in shock and agony. He staggered back, his hand clutching at the wound, his blood staining his clothes, his life force ebbing away. Lysandra screamed, a cry of pure anguish, of horror, of desperate love. She rushed to his side, catching him as he fell, cradling him in her arms, her tears streaming down her face, mingling with his blood. "Caleb!" she cried, her voice choked with emotion.
No.
"Please no," he looked at her, his golden eyes filled with pain, but also with love, with a fierce, unwavering devotion. He smiled, a weak, trembling smile, but a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that spoke of a sacrifice willingly made, a love that transcended death. "Lysandra," he whispered, his voice barely audible, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "I love you," those were his last words. His eyes closed, his body went limp, his breathing ceased. He was gone. Lysandra held him close, her body shaking with sobs, her heart shattered into a million pieces, her world plunged into a darkness she had never known before. She had lost him, her love, her protector, her soulmate, to the very evil she had been fighting against. The church was silent, the battle over, the hunters either dead or fleeing, the werewolves stunned into silence by the sudden, devastating loss. Only Lysandra's sobs echoed through the sanctuary, a mournful lament for a love lost, a life extinguished, a future stolen. Kaelin's mother, her face etched with sorrow and regret, approached Lysandra, her hand reaching out to comfort her, to offer solace, but Lysandra recoiled, her eyes filled with grief and accusation. "This is your fault," she hissed, her voice raw with emotion. "Your son, your family, they did this. They killed him." Kaelin's mother flinched, her eyes filling with tears, but she didn't deny it. She accepted the blame, the responsibility, the consequences of her family's actions. "I know," she whispered, her voice choked with remorse. "And I will spend the rest of my life trying to atone for it." Lysandra didn't respond. She didn't care. Nothing mattered anymore. Caleb was gone, and her heart was broken. Suddenly, a roar of fury, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, ripped through the silence. It was Kaelin. He had witnessed everything, the betrayal, the sacrifice, the death of the man he had once considered an enemy, but now recognized as a brother. He had seen the grief, the devastation, the love that had been extinguished. And he had snapped. He charged towards his grandfather, his eyes blazing with a golden light, his body transforming, his claws extending, his teeth baring. He was no longer the conflicted, manipulated son, torn between loyalty and doubt. He was a werewolf, an alpha, fueled by vengeance, by rage, by the need to avenge the death of an innocent. His grandfather, weakened and surprised by Kaelin's sudden attack, tried to defend himself, but he was no match for the fury of a grieving, enraged werewolf. Kaelin struck him with the force of a battering ram, knocking him to the floor, his claws tearing at his flesh, his teeth sinking into his throat. It was over quickly, brutally, justly. Kaelin stood over his grandfather's lifeless body, his chest heaving, his fur matted with blood, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of satisfaction and emptiness. He had avenged Caleb's death, but it had brought him no peace, no solace, no comfort. He looked at Lysandra, still cradling Caleb's body, her tears streaming down her face, her heart broken beyond repair. He knew he could never make amends for what he had done, for the betrayal he had committed, for the life he had taken. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the night, leaving behind the carnage, the sorrow, the consequences of his actions. He was an alpha without a pack, a son without a family, a man consumed by regret. And Lysandra was left alone, with the body of the man she loved, in the ruins of a church, beneath a cold, indifferent moon. Chapter 19. A Choice Between Worlds. The dawn arrived, painting the sky with pale streaks of pink and orange, a cruel mockery of the darkness that had settled over Lysandra's heart. She remained in the church, cradling Caleb's lifeless body, her tears long since dried, her body numb with grief, her mind unable to comprehend the reality of her loss. The surviving members of the Shadowclaw Pack, those who had remained loyal to Kaelin's mother, had gathered outside the church, waiting for her, their faces etched with sorrow, with guilt, with a shared sense of loss and bewilderment. They had witnessed the betrayal, the sacrifice, the death, and they were now leaderless, fractured, uncertain of their future. Kaelin's mother approached Lysandra, her steps hesitant, her eyes filled with compassion and a deep, profound sadness. She knelt beside her, her hand reaching out to touch Caleb's cold face, a gesture of respect, of mourning, of shared grief. "He was a good man," she said softly, her voice choked with emotion. "A brave man. A loving man. He will be missed." Lysandra didn't respond. She couldn't speak, couldn't think, couldn't feel anything but the gaping hole in her heart, the emptiness that Caleb's death had left behind. Kaelin's mother sighed, her gaze shifting to Lysandra, her eyes searching hers, trying to find a spark of life, of hope, of anything that could break through the wall of grief that surrounded her. "You need to leave this place, Lysandra," she said gently. "You need to grieve, to heal, to find your way. You cannot stay here, surrounded by death and sorrow. It will consume you." Lysandra finally looked at her, her eyes hollow, her expression devoid of any emotion. Where would I go?" she whispered, her voice raspy and weak. "My home, my life, it's all gone." Kaelin's mother nodded, understanding her pain, her loss, her disorientation. "You have a choice, Lysandra," she said. "You can return to your old life, to the human world, to the town of Ashenridge. You can try to rebuild what you have lost, to create a new life for yourself, away from the darkness, away from the werewolves, away from us." She paused, her gaze intense, her voice filled with a hint of pleading. "Or you can stay with us. You can join the pack, what's left of it. You can embrace your heritage, your power, your destiny. You can help us rebuild, to create a new future, a future where werewolves and humans can coexist, a future where love and loyalty triumph over hatred and betrayal." It was a choice, a crossroads, a decision that would determine the rest of her life. She could return to the familiar, to the human world, to the life she had known, but it would be a life without Caleb, a life forever haunted by his memory, by the loss she had suffered. Or she could embrace the unknown, the werewolf world, the life that had been thrust upon her, a life filled with danger, with uncertainty, but also with a sense of belonging, of purpose, of possibility. Lysandra looked at Caleb's lifeless face, her fingers tracing the lines of his features, memorizing every detail, etching his image into her heart, her soul. She remembered his words, his touch, his smile, his love, the sacrifices he had made, the life he had given for her. She knew what he would want her to do. He would want her to live, to fight, to embrace her power, to fulfill her destiny. He would want her to honor his memory, to carry on his legacy, to create a better world, a world where love and loyalty triumphed over hatred and betrayal. She made her decision. "I'll stay," she said, her voice firm and clear, her eyes filled with a newfound determination, a resolve that had been forged in the crucible of grief and loss. "I'll stay with the pack. I'll embrace my heritage. I'll fight for the future. I'll honor Caleb's memory." Kaelin's mother smiled, a faint, sad smile, but a smile that reached her eyes, a smile that spoke of hope, of relief, of a shared understanding. "I'm glad," she said softly. "You are strong, Lysandra. You have the spirit of a wolf, the heart of a healer, the blood of a leader. You will be needed." She stood up, her tall, slender figure silhouetted against the rising sun, a symbol of resilience, of hope, of a new beginning. "Come," she said, her voice inviting. "Let us leave this place. Let us bury our dead. Let us begin to rebuild. Let us create a new future." Lysandra nodded. She gently closed Caleb's eyes and kissed his forehead. A final farewell. She stood, her body aching, her heart broken, but her spirit unbroken. She would carry Caleb's memory with her, always, a guiding light in the darkness, a source of strength in the face of adversity. She followed Kalen's mother out of the church, leaving behind the carnage, the sorrow, the ghosts of the past. She stepped out into the dawn, into a new world, a world filled with challenges, with uncertainties, but also with possibilities, with hope, with the promise of a future she would fight for, a future she would create, in honor of the man she had loved, the man who had given his life for her. The pack was waiting for guidance, waiting for leadership, waiting for hope. They looked at Lysandra, their eyes filled with a mixture of grief, uncertainty, and expectation. Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts. The weight of expectation settled upon Lysandra's shoulders, heavy and unfamiliar. The remnants of the Shadowclaw pack, their faces etched with sorrow and uncertainty, looked to her for guidance, for leadership, for a glimmer of hope in the aftermath of devastating loss and betrayal. She was no longer just an apothecary, a newly turned werewolf, a woman grieving the loss of her love. She was by circumstance and by choice their leader. She looked at them, her heart aching for their shared pain, for the future they had lost, for the future they now had to build. She saw fear in their eyes, but also resilience, a determination to survive, to honor the memory of the fallen, to forge a new path forward. "We will mourn our dead," she said, her voice firm and clear, echoing through the stillness of the dawn. "We will honor their sacrifice. We will remember their courage, their loyalty, their love. But we will not despair. We will not surrender. We will not let the darkness win." Her words, though simple, resonated with the pack, stirring something within them, a spark of hope, a flicker of defiance, a renewed sense of purpose. They had been broken, scattered, betrayed, but they were not defeated. They were werewolves, survivors, bound by a shared heritage, a shared destiny, a shared commitment to creating a better future. She led them away from the church, away from the scene of carnage and sorrow, towards the ancient woods, towards the hidden sanctuary that had once belonged to her grandmother, to Caleb, to the lineage she now represented. It was a place of power, of healing, of connection to the past, a place where they could begin to rebuild, to regroup, to redefine themselves. They buried Caleb in a clearing bathed in sunlight, a peaceful, secluded spot surrounded by ancient trees, a place where his spirit could rest, where his memory would be honored, where his love would continue to inspire them. Lysandra spoke the words of farewell, her voice choked with emotion, but filled with strength, with a promise to carry on his legacy, to fight for the future he had envisioned. The days that followed were filled with grief, with healing, with the arduous task of rebuilding their shattered lives. Lysandra, guided by Kalen's mother, who had become her mentor, her confidant, her friend, began to learn the ways of the pack, the responsibilities of leadership, the complexities of their world. She discovered more about her own powers, her connection to her grandmother's magic, her ability to see visions, to sense the presence of others, to heal with her touch. She trained with the other werewolves, honing her fighting skills, mastering her control over her wolf form, learning to harness the power that flowed through her blood. She also learned more about the hunters, about their history, their organization, their relentless pursuit of werewolves. She discovered that her grandfather had been a high-ranking member of a secret society, a powerful, influential group dedicated to the eradication of their kind. He had been obsessed with the ancient ritual, with the promise of ultimate power, with the twisted ideology of a world cleansed of werewolves. But his death, though a victory, had not ended the threat. The hunters were still out there, scattered, disorganized, but still determined to carry on their mission, to avenge their fallen leader, to fulfill their twisted destiny. Lysandra knew that they would have to face them again, that the war was far from over, that the future remained uncertain. But she was no longer afraid. She had found her strength, her purpose, her place in the world. She was a leader, a healer, a warrior, a woman who had lost everything but had found something even more powerful, a love that transcended death, a loyalty that defied betrayal, a determination to create a better future. One evening, as the moon rose full and crimson in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the forest, Lysandra stood at the edge of the clearing, looking out at the vast expanse of trees, her heart filled with a mixture of sorrow and hope. She felt a presence behind her, a familiar scent, a warmth that stirred a faint memory, a flicker of longing. She turned, her breath catching in her throat, her eyes widening in disbelief.
It couldn't be.
It was impossible, but there he was. Standing before her, bathed in the moonlight, was Caleb. He was different, changed, his eyes no longer the golden hue of a werewolf, but a deep, vibrant blue, the color of the twilight sky. His body was scarred, marked by the wounds he had suffered, but he was alive, breathing real. "Caleb?" she whispered, her voice trembling, her mind struggling to comprehend the reality of what she was seeing. Is it really you?" He smiled, a slow, gentle smile that reached his eyes, a smile that filled her heart with a joy she had thought she would never feel again. "It's me, Lysandra," he said, his voice soft and familiar, but with a new resonance, a depth that she had never heard before. "I'm back." He explained then the story of his resurrection. He had been close to death, his body ravaged by the poisoned dagger, his spirit hovering on the brink of oblivion. But something had intervened, something powerful, something ancient, something magical. The ritual, the one that her grandfather had been performing, the one that had been disrupted by Kaelin's betrayal, had unleashed a surge of energy, a wave of power that had washed over the church, over the dying, over Caleb. It had healed him, restored him, transformed him. It had stripped him of his lycanthropy, of his werewolf nature, but it had also given him something else, something more. He was no longer a werewolf, but he was not entirely human either. He was something in between, a being touched by magic, by the ancient forces that flowed through the world, a being with a unique connection to the spirit realm, to the power of the moon, to the balance. He could never shift, never join her in wolf form, but their bond, their love, that remained. Lysandra listened, her mind reeling, her heart overflowing with a mixture of joy, relief, and confusion. She didn't understand how it was possible, how he had come back, how he had changed. But she didn't care. He was alive. He was here. And that was all that mattered. She rushed towards him, embracing him, holding him tight, her tears streaming down her face, mingling with his, a reunion that defied death, that transcended the boundaries of the natural world, that proved the enduring power of love. They stood there, beneath the crimson moon, their hearts beating as one, their souls reunited, their love a beacon of hope in the darkness, a testament to the enduring power of the human spirit, of the magic that still existed in the world. The future remained uncertain. The war with the hunters was far from over. The challenges they faced were immense. But they would face them together, as they always had, as they always would, their love a shield, their bond a weapon, their determination unbreakable. He looked down at her and gently wiped a tear from her cheek. "What now, Lysandra?" She looked up to him and took his hand. The pack was waiting. Her answer was simple. "Now," Lysandra said, a slight smile on her face. "We live." Epilogue. The years that followed were a testament to resilience, rebuilding, and the enduring power of love. Lysandra, guided by Caleb and Kaelin's mother, led the remnants of the Shadowclaw pack, forging a new path, creating a community that embraced both werewolves and humans, a sanctuary where differences were celebrated, where strength was found in unity. The ancient woods, once a place of fear and hiding, became a haven, a home, a symbol of hope. The pack grew, welcoming those who had been ostracized, persecuted, lost. They learned to live in harmony with the natural world, drawing upon the ancient magic that flowed through the land, harnessing its power for healing, for protection, for the betterment of their community. Lysandra, Though she still carried the scars of her past, the grief of her loss, found a new purpose, a new strength in leading her people, in guiding them towards a future where werewolves and humans could coexist, where love and loyalty triumphed over hatred and betrayal. Caleb, though no longer a werewolf, remained her constant companion, her advisor, her soulmate. His unique connection to the spirit realm, to the power of the moon, to the balance between worlds, proved invaluable in their efforts to build a bridge between the human and werewolf communities, to heal the wounds of the past, to create a future where understanding and acceptance replaced fear and prejudice. They never forgot the sacrifices that had been made, the lives that had been lost, the battles that had been fought. They honored the memory of the fallen, preserving their stories, their legacy, their spirit, in the heart of their community. The hunters, though scattered and diminished, remained a threat, a constant reminder of the darkness that still lurked in the world, a challenge that they had to face, a war that they had to win, not through violence and bloodshed, but through understanding and compassion, through building a world where hatred had no place, where differences were celebrated, where love and loyalty reigned supreme. Lysandra and Caleb, though they could never have children of their own, found fulfillment in nurturing the young of the pack, in guiding them, teaching them, sharing their wisdom, their experiences, their love. They became surrogate parents to a new generation, a generation that would carry on their legacy, that would build upon their foundations, that would create a future that was brighter, more hopeful, more just. One evening, many years after the events at St. Jude's, Lysandra and Caleb stood on a hilltop overlooking the valley where their community thrived, a testament to their resilience, their love, their unwavering commitment to creating a better world. The moon, full and silver, cast a gentle glow over the landscape, illuminating the homes, the fields, the forests, the lives that had been rebuilt, the dreams that had been realized, the future that had been secured. Lysandra, her hair now fully silver, her face etched with the lines of age and experience, but her eyes still shining with the same fierce spirit, the same unwavering determination, leaned against Caleb, his arm around her, his presence a constant source of comfort, of strength, of love. "We did it," she said softly, her voice filled with a quiet pride, a deep satisfaction. "We built a better world." Caleb nodded, his gaze sweeping over the valley, his heart filled with a profound gratitude, a sense of peace, a love that had endured the test of time, of loss, of transformation. "We did," he agreed.
Together.
They stood there, in silence, for a long moment, their hearts beating as one, their souls intertwined, their love a beacon of hope in a world that still needed healing, still needed light, still needed the enduring power of the human spirit. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of pine and earth, of wood smoke and wildflowers, of a future that was bright, of a legacy that would endure, of a love that would never die. And as the moon climbed higher in the sky, bathing the world in its gentle glow, Lysandra and Caleb knew that their journey was far from over, that the challenges would continue, that the darkness would always threaten. But they were ready. They were together. And that was all that mattered. They looked at each other and smiled. The end.